everyone. Welcome to the show.
Welcome to the show.
Welcome. Today on the show, we are going to talk about the Netflix series Baby Reindeer.
Can you say that in a Scottish accent?
Great. Good. No, I don't know.
Everyone in Scotland just went,
Ew.
oh.
Ew. Yeah, I have a lot of lineage in Scotland. My last name is Scottish.
I know you do.
Blah, blah, blah.
That's why I was asking you to do the whole show.
But I didn't grow up there.
Oh, okay.
So, but
I thought you did.
There's a bunch of TikTokers that I watch that are from Scotland, though. I love watching that because I'm like, oh, the homeland.
Yes.
Anyway.
Your mother's land.
The mothership. Anyway, we're going to talk about Baby Reindeer, which, for those of you who don't know, is a Netflix series where the real-life comedian, Richard Gadd, put his life on screen. He says that this is a true story. Netflix says it's a true story. And now there's all this litigation around it. But first of all, we're just going to talk about the series and what we thought of it.
Mm-hmm.
And there is this character in the series whose name is Martha, and Martha stalks Richard, and it goes very wrong. But also Richard shares a lot of what we believe are truths about like what happened to him in his life during this 3-year period of time. And so the series, and then we are going to talk about quote unquote the real life Martha. Of course, we don't know if it's the real life Martha or not, but there's this woman named Fiona Harvey who has gone on Piers Morgan, has been harassed online now, has been identified as the real life Martha. And so she's speaking out about it. I didn't watch a ton of stuff where Richard Gadd was speaking out about it, but now she's suing Netflix for defamation specifically because she's characterized as a criminal, like someone who actually went to jail for this, and she's saying that never happened. So we're going to talk about the show, and then we're going to talk about what we observed in the Piers Morgan interview and whatever else comes up.
Yeah, I mean, things just pop up.
The shit happens. I don't know if I can say I enjoyed the series because it's not an enjoyable thing to watch. In fact, Kathy, halfway through it, she's like, "I've started watching it, and
I couldn't even get through the first episode until,
I was like,
you were one of. Well, I was like, yes, I'm getting through these episodes because I hadn't read anything about. I think when I first started watching the series, I didn't even know it was based on anything
like a
real.
push play kind of thing.
Everybody was so unlikable in the first 30 minutes of the show that I'm like, why is everyone loving this? And then when you're like, hey, we're doing the show, just give it a minute because it's going to, there's kind of like this bait and switch that's going to happen. And once that happens, you're like, I get why I'm here. And then it really just turns into it, as much as it's labeled as like a thriller, it's a mental health series.
Absolutely. And that was why, obviously, why
I said to my partner, I'm like, this is why Shannon had me watch this because it's really rooted in mental illness and characterological disorders. And then really seeing the difference between those two, it made it rich. But to your point, I can't say that I enjoyed it as entertainment, but it was certainly rich with mental health stuff.
Absolutely. And I think it's a good cautionary thing. So if you haven't sat down to watch it, you've been hearing all the buzz, everybody's talking about it. We're going to explicate what it's about, what the pluses are, what you're going to kind of observe. And then you can make a decision on whether or not it's something that you'd like to watch. It is a quality series. I like a lot of the craft that's in it, meaning the way it's shot and the characters that follow. And they're episode 4, they kind of blow it wide open. And you really sort of understand how he got himself in this situation and what kind of mental state he was in when all of this started to happen. So it's definitely a mental health series. And I had a similar experience to you in the very beginning because I had heard all that about it and I was like, okay, push play. I'm like, oh God, she's so
this is
oh God, this is a little too oh boy.
Yeah.
They are very unlikable. And you sort of the whole time. I think it's a thriller in some ways because as an audience member, you know that feeling when you're watching something and you're like, ah, God, why'd you do that? Like in a horror movie, like, ah, God, don't go down in the basement, or why'd you do this with her? Why'd you give her that? Why'd you help? Why'd you be nice to her? Blah, blah. You're doing all of that.
Yeah.
In those first couple of episodes where you're like, dude, you are making every mistake. Plus, we've been talking about stalking. Obviously, we've done a handful of episodes on different ways to talk about stalking. And so when I read that this was a true story, obviously that's what we do. We talk about true stories and all of that. So I did enjoy the series in the sense that I think it's well crafted and it's an interesting story, regardless of the quote unquote true part of it. Like, I don't know.
Right.
Everybody's story is everybody's story. If this is the way he chose to tell the story, fine. You know.
Yeah.
Whatever.
While we're on my reaction to the show, though, I will say that the performances like really held up because I really had a lot of feelings about these folks.
Yeah.
And I just want to also point out, I think her name is Nava Mao. She
The
plays,
actress.
yeah, she plays, I guess, his girlfriend at one point, but she was fantastic, and I really enjoyed her performance. She plays Terry.
Okay, great.
And trans woman, just played this role so incredibly well. I think all the supporting cast, so Nina, I think it's Sosanya, who played Liz, like there's a lot of great, and Keely, the woman who played Keely, there was a lot of really great supporting roles in this that I'm like, wow, there's some really good up and coming folks that, and I think that was one thing I really enjoyed about this cast was they were primarily unknown. You know, some people, some of them had been in things before, but when you use too big of a name or a face, and especially these real stories, sometimes it's hard unless, you know, we're going to talk about Griselda, and that was different because Sophia was fucking amazing. But this was a great cast. So I will give it that. I thought the performances were good.
I did too. So part of Richard's true story is that during this whole process, he began to date his girlfriend, who happens to be a trans woman and a therapist herself, and she is a major character in this show and an interesting character. And if any part of that is representative of what was really happening between them, I think it adds a lot to the show, honestly, because after those first couple of episodes and she's introduced and we start to understand his mental health a little bit more, it sort of opens it wide up and becomes a lot more about mental health than just here's this kind of very off-kilter lady doing some out-of-bounds things.
Yeah, that's right.
So let's talk about these, the two main characters. So Martha's character is the character that everybody is commenting on and talking about.
Well, again, we have to remember that the way the story is told is through Richard's experience. So the way that he's painting her is this very delusional, obsessive, emotionally unstable, dysregulated, manic mess.
Manipulative.
And manipulative,
lying, grandiose, histrionic.
She's all over at Cluster B. She's a salad of Cluster B personality disorders.
She really does. Like, if we talk about Cluster B type of things, it's like the fears of abandonment and all of that in the borderline condition, the grandiosity and the manipulation and the characterization and the actually truly believing what you're saying is that like narcissism. And then there's this histrionic where it's like manipulative and trying to be seductive, and like she really does have a sound.
She's all over.
Independent too.
Oh yeah,
right.
Yeah, and then just that all or nothing of like one day she's obsessed, the next day she wants to kill him.
Oh my God.
So we see definitely a presence of that borderline personality with some, you know, narcissistic salad dressing on top, and you know the croutons would be a little histrionic because, you know, she would brag about all the people she knew. And again, using that, you know, seductive, I guess that's what it was.
It is. It's because we don't seduce just with sex, right? Like histrionic personalities can seduce with their tears, with their emotions. So she does a lot of like,
Right.
oh, woe is me. Oh, feel sorry for me. And he absolutely, that's one of the things is it's like he feels sorry for her. So that's how supposedly it all starts. And that is a histrionic trait too, like that infantilization that she does, like I'm a baby and take care of me and all that. And then, I mean, her whole inability to have any kind of sense of humor.
Oh, right.
Like the no insight and the rigidity around her, like she doesn't get the social cues. So then you realize you're also dealing with someone who does not have the social understanding to like pick up on things.
Right.
So like him giving her a free cup of tea, hypothetically, that becomes this whole thing. And it's like, it's just a free cup. Like it's a free
You
cup
don't
of
need to
tea.
read into it.
Like anybody, if it was a chick that gave you a free cup of tea and you were into chicks, would the same thing be happening?
Right.
Or because you're not into chicks, nothing would happen.
Right.
Like I don't, just a cup of tea.
She saw what she wanted to see.
Absolutely.
And what she needed to see. And then, it doesn't help that he, and then we'll talk about him in a moment, but to make it related to her responses to things is it doesn't help that he didn't shut her down right away. He was like, and you figure out later in the series, I don't want to give anything away, why he's responding the way he is, but you're like, dude, you're feeding this flame.
He was. And so that's an interesting piece of this, right? I think that's what most people, when they watch the first few episodes, are like, why does he keep doing that? Why does he keep being nice to her? Why does he continue to engage with her? Why does he say yes to certain things she asks for and all of that? And even if a lot of this is dramatization and isn't, wholly accurate of what exactly happened, that feeling you have when you know someone is unhinged and you let them in, you let them do things, you have those boundary issues yourself because of whatever reason, usually lots of trauma. And we all have a rainbow, a spectrum of boundary issues, and they pop out in different places in our lives. So it's not to pathologize boundary issues. We can all work on those. But he, when he doesn't go to the cops right away, and then his girlfriend has to, talk him into that. And he does, but he doesn't give them all the information and he's shy about it and he doesn't talk to them and he's not really explicit and he doesn't ring the bell many, many times to say this isn't okay. And he doesn't tell her no. It's like you don't want to blame the victim. You just don't want to. But then in your head, you're going, oh my God, if this was my client, I'd be like, you have to stop.
Well, and I think I want to reflect on something really quickly. We did an episode on Play Misty for Me a few weeks back, and we talked about how Clint Eastwood's character in that film was enabling, but it's like he didn't know, he was really naive and he didn't know how to stop it.
Yeah.
And he thought maybe if he did this, it would cool her down. This is not what I experienced with Richard Gadd's character. It's like he's toying with her in a way that he's like, and even his girlfriend calls him out. She's like, "You're enjoying this." So that's a very different. So it's an important piece because it's not just going in one direction, right? Like he's also getting some level of satisfaction from this. Of course,
it's layered, and that's kind of what you don't know in those first few episodes. So if you're going into it and if we're making a recommendation that you watch it, if this sounds like your kind of thing, like a complex psychological mental health drama, you don't know that in the beginning, but allow yourself to suspect that. And I think that's what makes it so psychological, is that it's like, as a therapist or as someone who understands psychology, you immediately think, all right, what's he getting out of this? What's the secondary gain for him in this, because that's what we do with clients who are embroiled in things, or ourselves when we're embroiled in things. That's the shadow. So what I really love is that by the end of the series, and this isn't spoiling like plot points, but it's a little bit spoiling like the character arc. The character arc is that you start to understand and realize, what is it in him that has him in this situation? And that's not blaming the victim. That's not any of that. It's literally what we need to do. We need to look at ourselves and say, what shadowy part of me had me in this situation over and over and over again with this person who every time I shut the door goes away and I re-engage her.
Right.
And so like, what is it about me that's doing that? And I think that's just one of the best parts about this series.
I do too, because he does hold himself accountable. He doesn't make himself look like a victim. Now, he is a victim in several ways in this, and there are multiple victims actually throughout this series. And I think it also, I don't want to say too much about what I'm going to say, just because you should watch it if you haven't seen it. But you will see that there are different characters, and how when things are rooted in trauma, like the mental illness component, versus like someone who's just a straight up fucking sociopath that exploits other people. So when people are like, I'll have students ask me like, well, what's the difference between someone's personality that might be really like deeply rooted in trauma and things that have happened to them versus like a cold-blooded fucking sociopath.
Right.
And I think that this series, there are so many characters that give you these different frameworks that you're like, well, here's a good example of here's this one and here's this one. And not that it justifies the behavior, but from a psychological perspective, we can say this person's character likely was a result of X, Y, and Z, where this person over here, it's really just rooted in character pathology. And maybe there's no trauma at all, right? And so I think that it's so rich in that way. And then his character, Richard's character, how he makes himself unlikable.
Yeah.
And that's, that was a risk he was willing to take.
Really good.
So I think that's fascinating, because usually when it comes from the narrative of the person who's been harmed, you don't see that shadowy side that you're talking about. No, not at all.
Yeah, no, the writers were really good. The writers, I felt, again, whether it's true or not, what is illustrated, like you're saying, is all these different psychological concepts. And like you said, I think that's a great thing to mention, is that there are examples of a lot of things in here. That this is definitely a series where one who teaches psychology, at least at the master's level or the doctoral level, could handle what's watching with what you're going to watch with trigger warnings. These would be some great scenes to use in sort of teaching those things and pulling apart what's up there. Even with Martha, because Martha is portrayed to have a mental illness, and she's a victim too. She's the hateable character in here. But I thought that there were lots of moments where they made her, where I thought, oh.
You have empathy.
Yeah, you have empathy. And what's different about it is that Richard gets himself into trouble because he feels sorry for her. And I think a lot of viewers of this series did that as well. But I think that if you can have empathy for her, which is different than pity.
That's right.
If you can have empathy for her, I think you can understand that all the people in this are broken and wounded and are working through that in multiple of different adaptive and maladaptive ways. So it's just a really good mental health piece. So I'm glad we got to watch it and talk about it and got past those first couple episodes.
Once they start to bring all these other characters in, though, and you get more of this backstory, if you're like me and you watch the first episode and you're like, I don't understand why people have continued this, really, I urge you to just keep going.
Yeah, and that's exactly kind of what I said to Kathy when, obviously she was going to watch them because we were doing an episode, but I said, don't worry. I'm not damning you to hell and watching this something awful for the sake of the show, because it's like episode 3, 4, certainly episode 4, but like episode 3, 4, it's kind of breaks wide open, which is our recommendation to you. Yeah, so then I watched then I, Googled and kind of looked into this for the show and watched that Piers Morgan interview with this woman named Fiona Harvey, who society at large has identified her as the person who is Martha in real life. And it's like a 55-minute interview.
It's pretty long.
Yeah, it's an hour-long interview with her on Piers' show, widely available for free online. It's his, YouTube channel or whatever. And so a lot of people are doing like critique of that interview, of like who she is and blah, blah, blah. And I think what's the most obvious or the general statement to say when you watch her is that she's being deceptive.
Oh my gosh. She straight out the gate, she says that she chooses him because he had legal issues like this as well. Almost like, we're the same, right?
Oh, and at one point she's like, "Oh, well, I'm 58 and I'm a year younger than you." She keeps trying to do that with him. That was all
at the beginning. She was just like, yeah, just like you, I'm a year younger than you. And I know that you've been in something similar. And he's like, I don't know if this is similar.
Such a borderline condition.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, you could see that all out.
Yeah, a little red flag there. But then there's other times where, she says one thing. He asks her a direct question. She gives him an answer. 5 seconds later, he follows up. She gives him a different answer. So there's the deception there is pretty obvious. I don't know why the deception, right? It's like, is it because it's not true? Is it because she truly believes what she's saying and then she just gives a different, like, I don't know. There's a lot of reasons for lying.
There has to be a delusional component though, because she knows that if she talks about never going to prison, and my thought is if that information were to come out, she's delusional enough to say that what the audience saw isn't true, and like this is the narrative I think she's really adopted, and maybe this is the part of herself that she has split off, is this offending part, because she sees herself as a victim only. And I think that's something to notice, within these personalities too, is their inability to really, really, really self-reflect, especially if there's narcissism there, is this inability to really take accountability and reflect and just say, hey, yeah, I was in a bad place and I did do this. They will die on that hill to cover that shame, so much that this is where there's like that. It's not that narcissists are psychotic, but they are in that borderline personality organization where there's a delusional component to save face. And she's very dedicated and committed to her innocence without at all saying like, yeah, that was me, but he exaggerated and I was in a bad place and I think he exploited me. That's someone who maybe had done some therapy work, maybe could have gotten to that place, but she's so static in this that this is a good example of when it's severe enough, these folks really don't make progress. They don't change.
Yeah. And the way I would characterize it too, which maybe adds another layer, is that we can all be at a borderline level of functioning. Now this is more depth oriented, more psychodynamic, more analytic, but we can all get ourselves into a borderline level of functioning, meaning that we're operating from all of these kinds of drives and defenses. I think what you're describing, Kathy, is if you or I, or someone maybe we know that went through trauma, was in grief, was doing this, was doing that, whatever, and we got ourselves into a place where we acted like that, or we made these poor choices, or we got obsessed because of all of these things that were going on in our lives. And then we got out of that and we went to therapy and we got into a better functioning state. We could say, yeah, that was bad.
I was lost. I was not well.
Here's what was going on in my life. And that would have been a really interesting interview too. Not quite as sensational, of course, but it would have been an interesting interview to say, this is why I got myself in that situation. And that would have been actually more what Richard Gadd is doing with this series. Richard Gadd is, and his writers or whoever, Netflix is saying, I was in this bad place and this is how I got myself into this situation. But because I can reflect and write about it and the arc of it, that means I've gotten better and I've learned a lot of things. Now, Fiona is not, if she is the real Martha, is not doing that. She's Kathy said, rigidly holding on to it. And that's kind of the difference between someone who may have, for me, who may have a borderline personality structure that's rigid and from childhood, is that there isn't that ability without long-term therapy and support to have that kind of self-knowledge or self-reflection.
And even just to build tolerance around insight.
Yeah.
Like, right?
She has no insight.
She has no insight.
That's the other thing you learned from this interview.
Yeah. Well, and there's such a rejection to it because of the vulnerability that would have to be there. And so it's like the work that's involved in making even just limited, and whether it's sustainable, that's a whole other thing, but even enough for her to approach an interview and say, I was unwell. I mean, that could take her years to get to.
Absolutely. If the trauma and the personality structures coming from when she was little and those childhood injuries, psychic injuries that often cause those things, then yeah. If the injuries and the trauma is happening right now, and we're in a borderline state of functioning, then we are all capable of a lot of these kinds of things with a certain set of circumstances. It would look different on each one of us, but that person's going to seek therapy. That person's going to go, wow, I have really made a mess of things.
That's right.
And I do not feel like I was in my right mind. And I wasn't. And then there's going to be that reflective process, whereas she's just digging in.
So, I'm referring now back to the Piers Morgan interview with Fiona. And if we're taking it from the fact that this is Martha is based on her, and she's saying throughout this interview, like, he's completely crazy, and none of it, because she's very convincing in a lot of ways to someone who may not, they haven't seen it or whatever. And really at the end of the day, it's like, could it be possible that he has made up this entire thing? It is. However, because it does, like, and I do believe everything we just said, by the way. I'm just kind of throwing like a devil's advocate, is the amount of emails and the numbers and stuff that he uses does feel embellished. Like, I don't know how much time someone would have to do something like that. I guess it's possible, but if you do the math, it's like you're never leaving your phone. It's day in and day out. And then there's some of these scenes where she literally sits there like on that bus bench like all day and doesn't move. And I'm thinking, like, would someone actually do that? I mean, maybe, but I can also see where that looks completely absurd and unrealistic, because even if somebody was crazy, just getting bored, and come. So I looked at some of that too when she was talking, and I'm like, it makes sense that the numbers that he used and the time frame that he used felt embellished, or that it was impossible, even though I do believe him, if that makes sense.
No, I understand. I think what you're speaking to is like what we were talking about with, he feels sorry for her, and that's what her way into it. And then when viewers watch her in that interview, that's why I throw in the histrionic stuff, is because if your number one reaction to her, which was a lot of viewers' reaction, is to feel sorry for her, and it's coming from a personality disorder, that's a super histrionic thing. So because it sounds so severe and so dramatic and so enormous, and like all these emails and all these
like
letters.
How could I have done this? Right.
Yeah. And I think that's also the tactic of what we see in some narcissistic leaders, right? Some narcissistic leaders will be like, well, that just sounds ridiculous what they're accusing me of, doesn't it?
That's right. Like, this is absurd.
But it's not.
It's
so,
not.
I hear what you're saying. It's like, okay, so if we consider, all right, he made it all up. For one, all of what we're saying. For two, Netflix is really not going to check it out.
No.
And then get sued.
Right.
They've literally put true story, blah, 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 blah. They didn't say based on.
Well, that's what that's where Piers Morgan is like, they've produced these emails.
They're going to check it out, right?
They've like, someone has these emails.
He says to her, I know you're not that tech savvy, but, they can prove it, right? And that's when she starts going, oh, well, maybe it was more than one.
10 or 12, a handful. I don't know.
Like, okay, so maybe there was a lot of them.
Her, I think the flippant, sort of, and then when she says, she doesn't even look like me, making that comparison. And then she starts to dig into like how unattractive the actress was. Well,
and that the actress is 40 and she's almost 60. Like, what the fuck does that matter?
Yeah, I mean, it was, well, she did a really good job shifting this is where like narcissists and histrionics and that sleight of hand, look over here so you're not looking over here. She did a mediocre job in shifting the focus into how wrong everybody else was or ill-equipped everybody else was the second the attention went on to her. And again, you've seen this in narcissistic political leaders. They're very good at going, no, look over here.
I think a lot of people are drawn in by her, honestly. I think a lot of people feel sorry for her and see her as the victim in this. Mm-hmm. Just like a lot of our narcissistic leaders have a lot of followers that believe what they say and they rise to power because of it. So I do think she has a lot of those skills and that sway, and I saw a lot of that in that interview. Mm-hmm. It's an interesting thing to dig into if you're into these kinds of stories, and we do recommend the series if you like heavy drama with a mental health component based on a true story. So
it definitely makes a good conversation.
Absolutely. Thank you for listening to this episode of Terror Talk. My name is Shannon.
And I'm Kathy. Sleep safe, everyone.